Okay. Now, I'll just be honest. I now I have a better idea. Like I said, for me, I remember a lot of people getting mad or impatient with me when I'd say I don't fully get why this was such a like one of your top 25 or whatever memorable moments in gaming history. Like I do understand what the emotional part, like the emotions on her face and whatnot. I do agree there. However, for me, I guess I always found that the finding her in the dungeon where she had been chained and you know was to await execution by Aghanim far more impactful for me. But I was about 2 or 3 years old when I saw that, so that kind of left an impact on me. Whereas Ocarina, it was several years later. But as for Ocarina of Time, what I just find funny is just um, how she tried to tell her dad that Ganon was not such a great guy, and yet her dad remained determined to trust in Ganondorf, which proved to be his undoing in at least I think two of the timelines. So, um, so that part of the story was also pretty funny. How Link and Zelda, who are basically kids, have to take up. Um, they have to take matters into their own hands to rescue the kingdom from the king's, no offense, but kind of stupidity and Ganondorf's villainy. I don't. Any thoughts on that part?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. And earlier when we were talking about how Ocarina of Time is in at least a part about failure and Link dealing with his own failure, there is no doubt that it was a failure on his end to accidentally let Ganondorf into the sacred realm, but it was a failure he had to experience because of wider failure by the society around him, right? Like the king just falling for Ganondorf's machinations at every single turn, and nobody doing anything to prevent what was obvious to even children, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and that's a pretty recurring thing with the King of Hyrule, is that he's kind of an idiot, and it's
And
the case. It's the case in Breath of the Wild as much as it is in just about every previous game. Um,
yeah.
so,
and
but
it's I think important that Link fails there, as failure is a part of growing up.
mhm.
And uh, well, we've all met with failure after failure. What's that Rocky Balboa line? It's not how hard uh, you hit, but it's how hard you can take a hit and keep getting back up.
Yeah,
And I think that's the case with this game in a way, as Link has to take hit after hit after hit, and yet he has to keep getting back up. And that's something I really do like. I think that that's also true in some other Zelda games, but in Ocarina, it's almost more true than most of the others. And it's very interesting that they were able to tell such a profound story and send such a profound message back in the N64 era, which is very fascinating, I find. Um, and arguably, this game was a lot shorter than modern games. It didn't have any of the graphical advancements of, say, Skyward Sword, which looks gorgeous, Breath of the Wild, which looks gorgeous, or Twilight Princess, which I think is probably the best looking Zelda game of all time. But Ocarina was able to tell such a incredible story. And what's what I, but yeah, it's very funny that children could see through Ganon and say, that guy's bad. Why can't you see it? And you have the king who's unable to see it, and the society at large, which is either unwilling or incapable of seeing it. And it's 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 kind of here where when you look at how far Hyrule sinks in the adult timeline, like just looking at that part of the game, I'm reminded of something Robert E. Howard, the writer of Conan the Barbarian, stories from the 20s and 30s, used to believe, and how civilization is temporary, barbarism is inevitable, and that every civilization is in the process of reaching its peak and then declining and destroying itself, and then returning to barbarism, which restores it to its proper values. And then the barbarism is also temporary, as the civilization will slowly but surely return to civilization. I guess you could say. I don't know if that's making any sense, but the idea is like all societies are in a process of rising, declining, and then destruction, and then rebirth in a way, and they're constantly going around in a circle. And there's a lot of historians currently wrestling with this and grappling with this theory. Most are saying no, it can't be true, but there's a hint of panic with them when they talk about it, because if it is true, then this is just temporary. What the era we're currently living in. I'm not trying to get on a soapbox or something, but with Ocarina of Time, you have this high point in civilization just after a war, I think, over the succession, the one that I think saw Link's father die, and then you've got a complete backslide into barbarism under Ganondorf. But what Ganondorf's rule also reminds me of real quick is Lion King with Scar. You know what I mean? Like, we see the Pride Lands under Mufasa, and we see it under Scar, and you kind of see the same thing with, while this king wasn't very smart, he was the rightful king under traditional archetypal rules and whatnot, I guess. And you see Ganon and how he would run the show, and it's just every man for himself. It's barbarous. There's no real civilization left. He basically just nuked it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, you're. I think you're definitely onto something there. I think that one of the things I really appreciate about Ocarina of Time is that it has, in my opinion, with the caveat that, again, I haven't finished Tears of the Kingdom, so maybe things will be different by the end of it. But in my opinion, it has easily the smartest and most adept Ganondorf we see in the entire series. You look at something like Twilight Princess, and it has a Ganondorf who primarily gets to the position he is through sheer power and through the co-option of people who are weaker than him. You have something like Wind Waker, where you have a Ganondorf who is almost sort of down on his luck. His power doesn't really extend that far by the time you put him down. And then you have Calamity Ganon, who's just a mindless beast, right? But in Ocarina of Time, you have a Ganondorf who is politically savvy. You see him trick the king, and you see him go to each of the different races and beat them into submission, not through force, but through trickery. By depriving the Gorons of their food until they are willing to agree, by poisoning the deity of the Zora so they have nobody to rely on, by poisoning the father figure of the Kokiri, so their protection is gone and they'll have to turn to him. And then we see it again when he comes to power, and these races are starting to think of rebelling. He doesn't just go out and crush them with the army, because he's a politically savvy enough guy to know that he doesn't need to do that. He can just keep each of these different groups of people busy by awakening an ancient evil for the Gorons, freezing the Zora so they're not an issue anymore, and letting monsters loose in the force of the Kokiri. so he doesn't have to stretch his powers thin, and he can keep all his powers sort of consolidated. So I really appreciate that they gave us such a politically savvy and active Ganondorf, who you hear about constantly going to all these different places, and almost like Ganondorf had a little adventure of his own before we started playing. Whereas with most Ganondorfs, they just go to their throne room and then send their monsters out and then wait for Link, right?
Yeah.
So that's definitely, I appreciate that. But in regards to what you were talking about in terms of civilizations in decline and then rise, I think the really interesting thing is that, like, if you look at Skyward Sword, and then if you look at the game that is furthest in the future, which would probably be Spirit Tracks, you see some pretty significant technological advancement, right? They go from fairly primitive people living in the skies all the way up to having automotives and vehicles and stuff like that. But then you see Breath of the Wild, which supposedly comes out after all the other games, and you see this massive reversion back to a really base civilization, where somehow they went from having these automotives and these locomotives back to, tribes cooking with campfire. And even within the games themselves, I think you see quite a lot of technological stagnation, which I think in part is due because of the fact that, in the Zelda timeline, they're just constantly getting wiped out every 2 or 3 games and having to start over.
Yeah.
So I definitely think that theory does apply to Zelda pretty well, both in the macro level of the individual games, or the micro level of the individual games, and the macro level of looking at the entire timeline.
And there's also the fact that, now, just to add to that theory, I think that there's also the factor that maybe the societies of Hyrule sometimes come to depend too much on the return of the hero. You know what I mean? Like, oh, well, maybe at some point the hero will return and solve our problems, so let's leave it to him. And then they don't solve the problem, and it just mushrooms in some cases. Not every, but like maybe this, which, well, all I'm theorizing is, to an extent, like, you look at what game was it? You look at you look at the prelude to Wind Waker when Hyrule was flooded. Like, basically the people in the king wanted to turn to the goddesses and to essentially the hero, like, solve our problem for us. Well, sorry, but you let the problem exacerbate to such a degree, and that is just a total disaster in every way. But that aside, when it comes to, now, what I find also interesting in Ocarina of Time is that I think it's the only game, one of the only Zelda games, now that I think about it, where you don't power up the Master Sword.
Yeah, that is correct.
Okay. Because for a minute I was like, wait, it has to have happened there, because, unless my memory is failing. But I just find that very amusing in how, in like A Link to the Past, which is the next in the Ruined timeline, or Fallen Kingdom timeline, I think it is, you have to power up the Master Sword. And you have other games like not Twilight Princess, Tears of the Kingdom recently, which, that one, you obviously are going to have to, because of what happens in the prologue. I can't do spoilers. And I plan to do that in a video tomorrow, but I can't do it here. I don't know how far people have made into Tears of the Kingdom. But But as to Ganon being a trickster of sorts, going around and screwing everyone over, this is an aspect of the character, I don't think you see too often, and it was a good factor in idea with the character. I just now on his end, I wonder what led to his failure to an extent. I wonder if it was maybe victory defeating him in a way, like like, oh well, I've got the Zoras where I want them. I froze their lake. What can they do against me? Or like I unleashed Volvagia on the Gorons. What can they do? I've got them right where I want them. If maybe victory kind of made him complacent.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely that, and I think it's also just an intense amount of hubris. I think that Ganondorf likes to be challenged. That's why when he interacts with Link the first time, there's always a smile on his face, and he's always giving off his patented Ganondorf evil laugh. Is because I think that he wants to rule, but he also wants to be challenged. He wants to have that final conflict, which is the reason why in almost every single Zelda game with Ganondorf in it, he meets Link before the actual final battle and spares him. He chooses not to kill him. It happens for sure in Ocarina, and it happens for sure in Wind Waker. I'm pretty sure it happens in Twilight Princess. I can't quite remember. And I think the only game he appears in where, again, I haven't completely finished Tears of the Kingdom, but I think the only game that Ganondorf appears in and he doesn't run into Link and spare him is Four Swords Adventures, and that's because we never actually meet him when he's Ganondorf. By the time we finally catch up to him, he's turned into Ganon. Mm-hmm. So I think it's very much part of resting on his laurels, taking victory for granted for sure, but also I think he has that character flaw in him where he needs to prove that he's the best, which is why even though this one Ganondorf has encountered Link many times, sees a boy in green and goes, oh, this is obviously the new Link. Like, theoretically, when he ran into Link outside of the castle when he was a child in Ocarina of Time, he should have just splatted his head on the concrete, right? Like, he should have just killed Link there and then his plan would succeed. Same with Wind Waker. When he was brought to Ganondorf all feeble, Ganondorf should have just killed him there and then, but he made the conscious choice to let him go because I think that Ganondorf has this intense desire to prove that he is as powerful as he believes he is, and time again chooses to prove it by swearing that this is the time he'll defeat the hero and giving Link a chance to catch up to him in the final battle, which is time and time again, with the exception of the downfall timeline, his downfall.
Yeah. In Downfall, at least in A Link to the Past, he seems more bent on getting rid of the sages. And he doesn't, I don't think he meets with Link before the final battle. And in there seems to be, well, at least in my opinion, it seems more like it's all business. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's kind of tricky with The Link to the Past because it really depends on whether you believe when he refers to Aghanim as his alter ego. It depends on whether you believe that Aghanim is just Ganondorf in disguise, in which case he does run into Link earlier in the story, or if Aghanim is just like a sacrifice to raise him, in which case he doesn't run into him later.
Yeah. But okay, I hadn't thought of it that way. In that regard, I guess that also kind of fits. He still seems pretty intent on those on those maidens and on Zelda, and then just getting rid of them first.
Yeah. So and they're also. Sorry, you go.
I was going to say he seems a bit more nervous about being sealed up again.
Yeah, for sure. What I was going to say is there's also in my mind there has to be a little bit of a divide between Ganondorf and Ganon, because even though they are the same character, right? The way that Ganondorf acts when he's in his human form and the way that he acts when he's in his bestial form is very different, which is why, like, I wouldn't expect him to be very politically savvy in The Adventure of Link or Legend of Zelda NES, right? Because he's just a giant raging monster.
But truly, the best middle ground between them is the 1980s Zelda's cartoons Ganon.
Yeah, absolutely. Or even better, the CDI Ganon.
Yeah. Sorry, I did a series of reviews on those, and that Ganon just always made me laugh. Like I could not take him seriously, but at least I laughed. Then again, I couldn't take Link seriously either.
I actually love the voice actor for Ganondorf in the CDI games. I love his deep voice.
Mm.
It's a shame he had
CDI.
such horrible lines to work with.
Mm.
Don't play them; they're horrible.
All right, but as for Ganondorf, I had to add the last part because I was, trying to. Yeah, I guess what I find interesting is how he does seem to take Link lightly, at least in Ocarina of Time. He doesn't. Now he's playing Link, so to speak, and outsmarting Zelda and Impa and Link at the child point in the game. But then when he meets with Link, when Link's running around countering his plans and gathering together, I guess you could say, a bit of a rebellion against him, Ganon is pretty slow to act. But it's interesting that Ganondorf does try to still maintain the upper. He tries to use more cunning, like you said. I do like that. On the other hand, it might sound harsh, but I find that I know a lot of people like that Zelda's Shike, and I don't mind that. But on the other hand, I find it terribly disappointing how Ganon so easily captures her, and from that point on, she's just like, "Oh, help me, Link." Yeah, well, you're a ninja chick. Help yourself. Can't you slit his throat in his sleep? Like, what do you need Link for? And yet, she's just utterly, you know what I mean? She's just a complete damsel in distress. And it might sound harsh, but I kind of find that, well, I get Malon. I got more respect for her. I got more respect for Saria, Maburu, and Impa. And yet you're just going to stand there when you're the best trained person in Hyrule. What are you doing? You have the power of the Triforce of Wisdom, the power of you're essentially from the reincarnation of Hylia, sort of. You're of the royal family, and you have those ninja skills, and you need Link to rescue you. What? And I know that's a weird. I know I'm going to have a lot of fans who are going to mob me here. I'm not trying to start something or be contrarian here. I just naturally am contrarian, but enough about my French heritage. But it's just, I find that this Zelda, on the one hand, I find her frustrating. On the other hand, I like that she tries to strategize against Ganondorf early in the game. I like that, she sends Link back in time. And from her standpoint, I find that a very fascinating decision, and I will kind of defend it. But it's just Zelda, like in the adult part of the game, I find weirdly more frustrating than actually cool or badass as others might. I don't know what your stance on her is.
I can definitely relate to how you feel. I've definitely always felt like it was really weird that Sheik is so seemingly competent throughout the game, showing off like a pretty high level of what seems to be training, but then is caught off guard so easily by Ganondorf at the end. I definitely can see where that's being frustrating. To me, I just sort of look at it as she was caught off guard. Like her and Link were having a bit of a moment, so to speak, when she was transferring the light arrows over and revealing herself. And it may just have been a moment where she was maybe letting her
Yeah.
like quite literally letting her hair down, and Ganondorf caught her lacking, so to speak.
Well, no,
But
that moment I get. It's in the castle itself after she's freed that I just wonder,
yeah, I mean, when you're trapped in a prison crystal, I suppose there's only so much you can do.
yeah, there I get it. But like once she's freed, she just, you know what I mean?
Why didn't she help fight Ganondorf?
Or help in the escape. She's really needing Link to hold her hand through the whole thing, and that I just find it's just that's where I find her a little frustrating.
Yeah, that's totally fair. I guess she just can't fight in a dress.
Well, she just I don't know, drop a smoke bomb and become Shike again?
That's true. Yeah. Yeah.
And
No. I mean, the lame answer, of course, is just that Nintendo wasn't capable of programming her to fight with you against Ganondorf, right? But from a story point of view, I can definitely understand where that is frustrating. Overall, I think that, in my opinion, Ocarina of Time, one of my few criticisms of it, and it's not even really that much of a criticism, but I definitely think that it has a fairly middling Zelda incarnation as far as things go. I definitely prefer most of the other 3D game incarnations. I think she's a little boring in Twilight Princess, but I like her better in she's just kind of there. She doesn't really do much.
I meant like her sacrifice and whatnot. I thought that was a beautiful moment.
That's fair. That is a pretty good moment.
But okay, so now, so you're feeling. I'm kind of surprised to hear that from an Ocarina of Time fanboy. So this Zelda's fairly middling.
Yeah, I just look at her in just about every other 3D game, like in Wind Waker. She's with Link for quite a lot of the game, right? And she's out doing things. She even tries to kung fu kick Ganondorf in the head, which obviously doesn't work, but it's the thought that counts, right? And then you have like Skyward Sword Zelda, where she is off on her own adventure for the entire thing. Her and Link. Yeah, her and Link have like a very clearly communicated relationship more than any of the other games. She's very highly intelligent and quite clearly cares a lot. And then even you have Breath of the Wild Zelda, who is very flawed, right? But she is very deeply written, and her inability to help is not from a lack of trying. Like, she tries as hard as she physically can. It's just not something that she can do until the very last moment. So obviously, like the 2D games that come before Ocarina of Time, and most of the ones that come after, the Zelda incarnations are they have sometimes 2 to 3 lines in the entire game. So obviously I like the Ocarina of Time one more than those. But I definitely do find the Ocarina of Time Zelda to be a little bit lame compared to the later ones. I don't think she's a bad character or anything. I just think the others are that much better.
Oh, okay. I don't know. I honestly don't know how to judge her. Sorry. The first part, I think that it was a very daring move to make her a kid in the first part of the game. Her and Link being kids, I thought that was a really interesting part of the game. I still think it's one of the most bold, creative decisions for such a game to undertake. And yet, I think that, like I said, I may get irritated with that last level of Zelda, but on the other hand, this is a Zelda I am quite familiar with and I quite like deep down. So I'm surprised at such a rating, but I don't really have an argument, as you're more familiar with Zelda than I am, obviously. And I think that, I think that this Zelda does merit the Triforce of Wisdom. Now, as much as I said that I find it really irritating how she just basically becomes a damsel all of a sudden, on the other hand, thematically, she's, well, this is Link's story in a way. He's the warrior archetype, and she's the lady fair he has to kind of rescue, or at least the queen archetype. He's Gawain, or I mean Gawain. She is kind of the queen, so he has to. He's there at her service, is what I mean. Like, and they're fulfilling a very archetypal, thematic type of story and well, tale that they're doing. This is inspired by, like I said, medieval literature. All fantasy fiction is. And the thing with Link is here he's just basically the story of Gawain or Percival serving the queen or defending her honor. So in that regard, Zelda not fighting her own battle, so to speak, kind of also makes sense from a thematic point of view. So while I get irritated, I do understand it from another point of view, I guess. And, well, on the other hand, as to her final choice to send Link back in time, what are your thoughts on that one?
I think that it was the wrong decision, but I think it was an incredibly compassionate thing for her to do. Mm-hmm. It ultimately doomed Link to a pretty miserable life, but I don't think she had any way of knowing that was going to happen. No. I think if you asked Link what he wanted to do, he would probably say stay just because he wanted to keep everybody safe. But deep down, he probably would want the chance to relive his childhood. But obviously, there's no way for her to know that it was going to essentially be dooming the timeline.
I have a theory about that, and mine is that I think she might have theorized that sending Link back in time to relive his childhood and stop Ganondorf, I think she was probably running with the logic that it would erase the present timeline.
Interesting.
You know what I mean? Like, her notion was this, it's like the idea that I think it's Midnight Trunks from DBZ originally theorized some events shouldn't happen. So let's just go back to an earlier point in the timeline, fix things, and maybe our timeline will disappear. That's not what happens in Dragon Ball Z, and that's not what happens in Zelda. But maybe that's what she was kind of thinking. Like, okay, if I send him earlier in the timeline and we just retrace things, except in a better direction, maybe that'll fix things. And, like, I won't have the memories, but Link will probably be the only one with the memories. But ultimately, it'll be happier. It'll be a better timeline. But that's not what happened. She split the timeline in a way. And, well, not in a way, she did split the timeline. But maybe she didn't know she was kind of creating this paradox, so to speak. I don't know what you think of that theory.
It's definitely interesting. I've never really thought about that. It would seem to be pretty in line with her character to be that forward thinking. So it definitely seems like it's a sound theory. I definitely don't think it would be any way for her to know that she was splitting the timeline, especially since I don't think Nintendo really knew they were splitting the timeline until about 10 years ago.
Very true.
So
it's not until like the past, 10 years or so that Nintendo decided that we want a full-on, how should I word it? We're committed to a storyline here. Like, you know what I mean? Like, we're committed to each of them being in the same universe.
Yeah, it was the lead up to the Hyrule Historia where they finally sat down and figured out what game goes where. Although still, I don't think they're very committed to the timeline. They pretty much immediately abandoned it right after releasing it with Breath of the Wild.
Yeah.
But that's the Zelda team for you. They care about the lore a lot less than we do.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of, I wasn't going to word it that way, but yeah, c'est vrai. What I find funny about that is, on the other hand, I think that there's a lot of missed opportunities to an extent because this might sound weird, but I struggle with playing video games. I just find that usually I don't have. It might sound weird, but I don't have the attention span for playing solo games anymore. I can play games socially, but I can't play them on my own. I get bored, and I can't even play my favorite games anymore on my own. But movies and novels, I can enjoy. I can read a book for 5 hours and I won't even notice the time. But a part of me kind of wishes they would release Legend of Zelda novels and whatnot. It doesn't just have to be about Link or Zelda, but like, you know what I mean? Expand the lore, expand the mythos, like maybe explore what the average commoner thinks over in Hyrule Castle Town. Maybe the average guard, what's his life like? Maybe the Gerudo, how they built up such a beautiful civilization in Breath of the Wild. Like, I know this is kind of weird and bizarre, I guess. And it's not that I want them to make the same mistakes to say the Blizzard team has done with the Warcraft novels, which seem like a confused mess. Not to badmouth Blizzard too much, but a lot of those novels, when I try to get into them, they're just such a confused mess. Not all of them, but some. But then when I look at like Lord of the Rings, Conan, there's a good thing going there, and I just think that maybe, and even Dragonlance, there's a good thing going there. So maybe Zelda could learn, Nintendo and the Zelda team can maybe learn from that. I don't know what your thoughts are on the idea of the overall Zelda, like expanding the franchise to novels and whatnot.
I think it's a great idea. I don't think it'll ever happen. And if it does happen, it'll be treated the same way the manga are. The way I think that the Zelda team, obviously my name isn't, Aonuma, so I don't know what is in the man's mind, or Fujibayashi now.
Or Miyamoto.
Or Miyamoto back in the day, yeah. But the way it seems to be is that the Zelda team only really cares about the lore in as much as it relates to the current Zelda game they are making now. And they completely disregard it in other ways, right? Like a really good example of it, relating to Tears of the Kingdom, is this is not a spoiler. It's right from the trailer. But in the game, they refer to the imprisoning war. And the moment that happened, everyone got so excited. They're like, oh man, is this relating to the imprisoning war we've heard about in previous games? No, it's just it's referring to its own in-universe imprisoning war, completely separate from the old games, right? And that really upset a lot of people. But I think that's just a perfect example of how the Zelda team only really cares about lore in as much as it affects the current game they're working on. And because of that, things like the manga, things like the Hyrule Historia and the Hyrule Encyclopedia all have lore bits in it that I'm sure the Zelda team just completely disregards. So if we were to get novelizations or something like that, I think it would very much be the case where a novel would write something that would get immediately overwritten by a future game and would just lead to everybody getting even more confused and complicated, because
Yeah.
it would be like trying to mesh the expanded Star Wars universe stuff with the current Disney universe. Like
it's
the people making the games would just not care about all of the supplementary material, and they just make what they want to make, which is beautiful. It's frustrating for the fans, but there's also a certain beauty to it.
There's something James Rolfe, AVGN, once said. It's that the Zelda timeline and issue here with the lore and whatnot is an unsolvable puzzle. It's a mess in a way, and it's one that the fans are determined to solve, but the creators, I think he said something like, they're not at all interested. Like they're not really delving too deep into it. But at the same time, we have seen them prove themselves capable of really doing a great job when they put their minds to lore for the current
Yep.
game. They can do
Yeah.
some great work with it. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash that like and that subscribe button as though you were Link putting an end to Ganondorf.